So in 1984, a movie called Ghostbusters came out. It was an overnight hit, a lot of fun. Immediately they called for sequels, and we got some. We got Ghostbusters 2 in '89, and then 2016 we got a reboot. But something was missing from the reboots and the sequel. There was something missing. Well, in this video I'm going to get into what I think it was, because they figured it out. And the new movie, Ghostbusters Afterlife, is a lot of fun, and it's better for it. So the first thing we want to ask, here in the Imaginarium we talk about dreams, but we also talk about narrative and storytelling, the art of storytelling. So I'm going to kick off this part of the channel with a discussion of Ghostbusters, because the movie just came out and I saw it recently. It's a lot of fun. But the question has always been, and this is a question that's been around for a long time, is why Ghostbusters was so popular in the first place. You would think it would just be yet another kind of zany fantasy comedy of the 80s. There was a bunch of them back in that time. But it's stuck. The legacy stuck. People still talking about it. They came up with a cartoon series. They had sequels. They had reboots. All this stuff. Why? Why was this so popular? Well, before I get into that, I want to kind of talk about the sequels. And we're going to examine them for what it is that's different about the subsequent ones that the first ones seem to have. So, if you go back to the very first one, it's a pure adolescent boy fantasy. The characters, it's a coming-of-age story, really. Although the characters are adults, they act like adolescents. Okay, it doesn't take that long to notice this in the movie. Like, okay, Venkman, you start off with Venkman acting like a total jerk. He's just trying to score, he's goofing around, he's supposed to be a scientist doing research. But most of the time he just spends a whole lot of effort trying to be cool. You know, we've all met those in high school and so forth. So, that's where he starts in the story. Ray is just a big kid inside an adult body. He's very earnest, he's very sincere, he gets extremely excited about cool fun stuff like ghosts and all that. So he's just a big kid already. And Egon is a very hyper-focused, kind of awkward science nerd guy, very socially kind of stunted. Winston is he's the most mature of the group, and it's very notable that he doesn't come in until halfway through the movie. So, and he's just trying to pay the bills. He's just a regular guy trying to pay the bills. He's not an adolescent at heart. So you take this likable but kind of bungling group of scientists, using the term kind of loosely, and you put them into this story that makes them save the world. They have to save the entire world from the invasion of Gozer, this great big Sumerian god. So you have what essentially is a coming-of-age story and an epic fantasy. An epic fantasy is the type of story where you have a small group of people that work together to save a kingdom or a country, or in this case, the whole world. Epic fantasies are a very popular genre. Obviously, people have heard of Lord of the Rings. It's the same type of thing, only much more serious, of course, in that. And then you take that story structure, you take the coming-of-age pieces of it, and then you throw it into modern New York, at least modern for when it came out. It's very cynical, it's kind of dull, it's boring, and you know, like all of the adults that are around the Ghostbusters are jaded and just kind of beat down. And then you throw ghosts in there, right? So all of a sudden, it's kind of like a story that brings the magic of youth back into the adult day-to-day grind of adult life. Star Wars had a lot of this too, and it was one of the biggest features, I think, of why that movie was so successful. And I've talked about that in other videos, but anyway. So, that's Ghostbusters in a nutshell. Super popular for those reasons. People wanted a sequel. So, a few years later, they have Ghostbusters 2. And while it wasn't bad, it was just kind of, okay, it was fun. But it didn't have the same spark as the first one. And so, why? That's the question. Well, in order to get into that, you want to know what it is about sequels that needs to be accomplished in order to have a successful one. Now, I'm by no means an expert on this, but I'm just looking at the psychology of it. I think that a successful sequel, as opposed to an unsuccessful one, is one where you take the original story, and by a sequel I mean a true sequel, right? Not part of an ongoing story that's already been established. So The Two Towers is just a continuation of The Lord of the Rings. It's not technically a sequel, because a sequel would be, you've got a complete story like Ghostbusters. There was no intention for a sequel. They just told their story. They blow up the Marshmallow Man and save New York, and that's that. But it was so popular, they said, well, we got to come up with another story. Okay, so what do you want to do for that? So what you want to do is you want to tell a story that's got many of the same elements, but you've got to twist it a little bit, or else people will complain it's too much the same. If you twist it too much, people will complain it's too different. So you've got a very tough job ahead of you for the screenwriter, or the novelist, or whatever, in writing a sequel. Unless you're just repeating the same story over and over and over again, it just seems to be super popular, like James Bond, for example. But they didn't want to do that for this. They wanted to try to tell a fun sequel. So, of course, you get in the first one, you're in New York. You've got this evil spirit from who knows where that's attacking. You get these bungling but mostly good-natured science guys. They allow their immature spirit to prevail and mature a little bit. They overthrow the staid adult world of environmental regulations and cynical adult leaders and schmoozing politicians and all that. And they win the day, though. The childlike wonder and goofiness and awkwardness win out over that. So in Ghostbusters 2, they try to repeat that, but they don't quite get there. You still have New York. You've still got an evil spirit that's trying to invade, and Dana's caught up again in it too. Sigourney Weaver's character, instead of being the gatekeeper and the keymaster and all that sort of stuff, her son is caught up in the drama. The same three guys, the bungling science guys, get together, fight the bad guy, they win. But something is missing. Not only is this plot exactly the same as the previous one, with really no twists at all, it's different in the wrong way. The ways in which it is different are ways that don't help. The plot is too similar to the previous one, but they don't have the adolescent coming of age energy that the first one does. Instead of being completely out on their rears, like they are in the first Ghostbusters movie, they're relatively established. So Peter's got his own television show, Ray has a bookstore, Egon is in charge of his own lab, Dana's still doing fine, has her own child. Everyone's maturing and doing grown-up adult stuff. So when they have to get back together to defeat evil, you don't have that childlike energy there that is having to overthrow the cynical adult world. They're kind of a part of it already when the evil guy shows up. And so it doesn't come across as quite as magical and as powerful. Instead, it's just these guys, oh yeah, we're the Ghostbusters, let's get together, let's take care of Vigo, the Carpathian, and all that stuff. So it doesn't really do what a sequel should do. It does a lot of it. It is a lot of fun, and it's a hilarious movie in many places, especially with Peter McNichol. His character is just a hoot. But as far as like getting to the deeper level, the part that resonates with people, that makes them want to see it over and over again, and captures their imagination, it doesn't quite have the same spark. Now let's take an example of a movie that does it well, that does the sequel thing well. Empire Strikes Back, classic example. So it's a similar type of story, but it's flipped around. Instead of the great big battle between good guys and bad guys at the end that you saw in A New Hope, they start off with the big battle. And instead of having our hero Luke Skywalker arise from obscurity to come and save the day, we see him plunge into darkness. In fact, there's a scene in The Empire Strikes Back where Luke literally plunges into darkness. So they're not subtle with this. Instead of a desert planet, you've got an ice planet, right? So they do some change-ups in the scenery and all that sort of thing. But the characters that are there are still consistent with what they were before when you last saw them. This is one of the problems with the Star Wars sequel trilogy. They waited so long to make them, and they changed the characters because a lot of time had passed there, and they needed to for various reasons. But it didn't quite click because a lot of the fans were like, would Luke really do that? Would Han really do that? You know, things like that. So they had their work cut out for them, certainly. And the result has not been super pleasing to the fans. So fast forward then to the reboot. Okay, I won't spend a whole lot of time on the reboot because it is a different story, but not really. But again, in this case, the characters were still not quite... It was Ghostbusters 2. It was the characters weren't quite immature enough at the start to give them any sort of growth into the world of adulthood. They were still misfits, they were still zany, and there was a lot of funny stuff in that movie, but it didn't quite click. And the nostalgia factor, too, which is always a piece of the puzzle when you're writing a sequel. You want the nostalgia to add to the story. In this case, they garbled it. They had the characters from the original, but they weren't playing who they were in the original. And so it just came across as tonally strange. Didn't work for a lot of folks. I kind of scratched my head when I saw that part of it. I'm like, okay, well, why are they doing that? It's bizarre. So it kind of took you out of the story. Now, what is the missing ingredient? What did the first Ghostbusters have that the others didn't have that they figured out and put into Ghostbusters Afterlife? I think it's children. Whereas in the first one, the children were the main characters. They were just man-children. And they made them likable enough to you could kind of laugh at their awkwardness and their goofy antics and carryings on. But you know, you can only put up with so much of that, and they do grow through the story and wind up saving the city. So rather than try to do something like that, especially with the characters that were much older now, they just said, let's use actual children instead of man-children who need to grow up, but they're funny enough to be entertaining. Instead, let's take actual children and let them fight the bad guys. And it was, I think, the key storytelling element that made it work so much better. Not to mention they did a lot of the other things that we talked about before. They took the same basic story, which is Gozer trying to break into the world of the Earth from wherever it is that Gozer's from. You get the Keymaster, you got the Gatekeeper, you still got that stuff, and they twisted it a little bit. All right, instead of a giant marshmallow man that there's only one of, they've got hundreds of little tiny marshmallow men. Right, so they flipped that. Instead of downtown New York, again, which we've already had 3 Ghostbusters movies in New York, they said, let's completely change that up and have it out in the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma somewhere. So the color palette is different. The background is different. So, but of course, doing that means that they have to give it the small town, you know, kid coming from somewhere else trying to fit in with the small town, and they, of course, played that to a T. Instead of having them try to grow up, people who are already adults growing up and kind of engaging with their inner child, you had Mom who was trying to connect with her estranged father. So doing that plus layering in a ton of nostalgia, even down to the classic 80s trope of the little kid who goes into the attic of someone who they never knew to find some kind of treasure, right? That's a classic 80s fantasy film trope. Those of us that were around back in the 80s, you know, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and it was the days of yore, that we all remember that, and of course it brings up those fond memories of when the Ghostbuster movies came out. I was a teenager, so Anyway, that's my take on why I think Ghostbusters Afterlife worked, but the sequels to the original Ghostbusters didn't quite work. They were still entertaining in their own way, and they were fun, but they were much more forgettable. It was the element of the coming of age and or just literally children growing through the story that made it more resonant and more emotionally connecting. So, I'm going to be doing more movies. We'll be working with Nick on a couple of deep dives into depth psychology and cinema for that series. So stick around and like, share, subscribe.